Chairman, committee, thank you for the indulgence that you've given us. We've met several times on this, and you've heard a lot, and I'd like to, if you just give me several minutes, let me kind of answer some things. One of the first things I picked up today is two of the people testifying and say, why do you want to call it marijuana? Call it what it is. So I want to give y'all the history of why it shouldn't be called marijuana. The Anglo-Saxons invented basically the English language back in 550 BC. AD, and moving forward all the way up until the 1900s, we called it cannabis. I'm calling it what it is, but I want your committee and I want the people know and I want your people listen to understand why we shouldn't call it marijuana and understand the ones who say call it what it is, why we will call it what it is and why we won't call it marijuana. There's a man by the name of Harry Anslinger who's an extreme racist who testified in Congress and he named it marijuana, and while he was testifying in Congress, this is what he said, committee: marijuana is the most violent causing drug in the history of mankind. Most marijuana smokers are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, entertainers, and their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from the marijuana usage. So let's just be really clear, we're calling it cannabis because that's what we called it for the first 1,500 years that the English language had been used. Secondly, this idea that this is a gateway theory, you heard that 2 or 3 times a day. Congress asked the National Academy of Sciences to do a study on the theory that marijuana is a gateway. A gateway to what? A gateway to worse or more incredulous drugs. At the end of the 19-month study, the National Academy says there is no conclusive evidence that marijuana is a gateway to further drugs. However, alcohol and tobacco are. Ladies and gentlemen, just because man can pervert something, that doesn't mean it should be outlawed. First 5 years of Colorado, after they had medical marijuana, law enforcement was asked 5 years later, and you know what the word that the law enforcement used? It's been completely uneventful. By the way, Alaska was the first to do this. Everybody wants to look at Colorado or California and look at all the stuff that they say, oh, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. Plenty of other states who've been doing this and have successfully done it and helped their sick people. This is another interesting study. We talked about people who have died, and when they died or there's traffic accidents, there's THC in their system. So y'all know, each of my colleagues have been up here a while, know that I've studied this plant. I've traveled actually out of this country, I've traveled to many of the states studying it. I've spoken with the U.S. Department of Health. I've spoken with our very own TBI. I've spoken with the FBI, and I've spoken with the CDC. Now, this is important that you get this, committee. There is not one documented study that the sole contributing factor of a person's death is marijuana. Please understand, there is not one that the sole contributing factor is marijuana. However, committee, I will let you know that I can show you one today where the sole contributing factor is an FDA-approved drug. I can show you today, right now in Nashville, that somebody died or will die because of an FDA-approved drug. But you will not find one in the history of America that the sole contributing factor is marijuana. Marinol has been brought up many times today. Interestingly, you'll find this, if you study their label, it can cause death if you abuse Marinol, and pregnant women and children are not allowed to use it. I also heard that we're worried about dogs, drug-sniffing dogs. Committee, this little lady right here, now we have several dogs at home. We just had puppies. But I want you to understand, this little lady, Mr. Vogus, the professor back there from Vanderbilt, and his son Aiden, they are worth a million times more than a dog. And I feel horrible that a dog might lose their job sniffing out drugs if something like this happened. But I can't believe we would even bring this into the equation when we have Josie and Aiden in this room. This is crazy. Interesting thing about my bill, if you study it, the very most extreme conservatives in the House to the liberals in the House have signed on to this bill. We have people from Michelle Malkin, who is always on Fox News, who's a right-wing girl, who is advocating now for marijuana. Do you know why she's advocating for medical cannabis? Because it's saving her child's life. All the way to Joe Montana. This is what Lamar Alexander said. I personally talked to Lamar Alexander about it. One of the best things Washington, D.C. can do for Tennessee is to respect the constitutional prerogative of state legislators and governors to make decisions on behalf of the people who elected them. I respect the rights of the state to make their own decision. The reason I found this out from our Senator, Lamar Alexander, is in 2014 when I filed the bill for this little lady right here, there was an amendment that was going through the Federal Appropriations Act. It was by Senator Roy Brocker and Senator Blumenauer. That went in 2018, and I feel obliged to read you that amendment and why it applies today. This goes into the Federal Appropriations Act every year since 2014, and President, what's our president's name? Trump. He just signed it. Thank you, Representative Camper. He just signed this Friday. Now listen to me, committee. This is important. I personally called Senator Lamar Alexander's office in 2014 and asked them to do this, and I called my Congressman Phil Rowe. I said, please add Tennessee into this amendment. None of the funds made available in this act, Federal Appropriations Act, to the Department of Justice may be used with respects to the states of, and back then 2014 it listed about 20 states, now it's moved to 29 states, including Tennessee, to prevent such states from implementing their own state laws that authorize the use, the distribution, the cultivation of medical marijuana. Ladies and gentlemen, also 4 times in the history of the Supreme Court of the United States, our Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government cannot compel a state to uphold a federal law. That means if the federal government has passed a law, it is their responsibility to enforce the federal law. All I'm doing is saying when it comes to this, we have some sick people that the state of Tennessee is not going to enforce the federal law. And I'll tell you, 2 of the most important things that have happened of these 2 that the Supreme Court has ruled the federal government can't enforce us, is the Fugitive Slave Act, which we've talked before, which is very profound for us. And there's a good reason that Pennsylvania sued the federal government because they didn't want to enforce that. And also we have Prince versus the U.S. That's when they passed the Brady Bill in the 90s, and it was saying that law enforcement was going to have to pay to be able to do the background checks. We found out, you know what, the federal government cannot force the state to do that. Committee, that's what I'm doing. I'm saying the federal government cannot force me as a state. It is very constitutional, been upheld 4 times, very constitutional what I'm doing, regardless of what you've heard law enforcement say. Now, 2/3 of the population of America have access to this plant, whether it's for medicinal purposes or for recreational purposes. I've heard also that they're worried about the monthly supply. The monthly supply comes in, that's why you have to have a doctor's order. It tells you how much you're allowed to have in a day's time. And so a patient would have the doctor's order that says you can have 5 milligrams of this each day. This is pretty simple for anyone who would stop a person to understand exactly what's going on. The National Academy of Sciences, and you've heard them quoted a lot on the opposing side, have given, and our friend from just north of Nashville says that they admitted there are 4 things that cannabis works for. But I don't see the Department of Health or our good representatives saying, you know what, as a state, let's do something. So committee, what I want you to know is I've traveled, I've met thousands of Tennesseans, and I've met them who've moved away from here, and I've met them who are here. And this is the most important thing that you need to hear from me today. We have Tennesseans who are illegally alive today, and they're doing well, but they're breaking the law. My question is, why would we want to have the law be able to arrest these type of individuals or put them in jail or give them a criminal record when they're fighting to stay alive? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee.